At 1 a.m., the pounding on my front door rattled the glass panes so violently I thought it might shatter. I stumbled out of bed, my heart racing the floor, cold against my bare feet. Through the wood, I heard my name, a voice I had known all my life, but now, thin, broken, trembling. I swung the door open and my mother collapsed across the threshold. She fell into my arms with a weight I had never felt from her before, not the weight of age, but the weight of someone who had been broken. Her breath was ragged, her lips wet with blood that smeared onto my shoulder. Her face was swollen, her right eye nearly shut, cheekbone purple and already puffing. She clutched at my nightshirt with shaking fingers and whispered words that cut deeper than anything my father's fists ever could. "Your father hit me, Rebecca. He hit me for Denise." Denise. The mistress. The woman everyone in Greenville whispered about at the grocery store, the woman whose laugh carried too loudly at the bar when she leaned into my father's arm. I had seen the looks, the sideways glances, the pity aimed at my mother who pretended she did not notice. Tonight, that unspoken humiliation had turned into bruises. My father, Richard Turner, once stood like a pillar in this town, a retired coach with a booming voice and the respect of neighbors. But I looked at my mother's body trembling in my arms, and all I saw was a coward who had traded his vows for violence. My mother tried to sit up, gasping, and through her sobs, she choked out fragments of what had just happened. He had called her useless again. He had told her no one would believe her if she told. He had slammed her against the wall while Denise laughed from the sofa, her glass of wine clinking as if it were entertainment. And when my mother tried to stand her ground, he struck her so hard she tasted blood, then shouted that Denise was worth more than she would ever be. I felt my stomach turn fury, flooding every nerve. I dragged her inside, laying her onto the couch, trying to steady her shaking frame. I pressed a towel to her mouth, but blood seeped through anyway, staining the fabric. My hands were trembling so violently, I almost dropped the phone when I reached to dial 911. Yuan. Outside, porch lights were flicking on up and down the street. I saw silhouettes of neighbors in bathrobes leaning over rails, some whispering to each other, some holding up phones as if already recording. One child pulled aside a curtain to stare with wide eyes before a mother yanked him back. The humiliation burned as sharp as the rage. My mother, who had spent decades feeding these very neighbors after funerals and baby showers, was now the object of their late-night gossip. Inside the living room, her chest heaved, every breath a rasp. She clutched my wrist and begged me not to let him find her. Her fingers dug so deep I could feel the desperation in her bones. The air smelled of iron and sweat, the sound of her coughing echoing like a drum in my skull. I wanted to scream, but I bit it back, focusing on keeping her conscious. The words my father had spat at her rang in my head like poison. "You are nothing without me." I had heard echoes of that line my entire childhood. Gaslighting control, the quiet tyranny of a man who knew exactly how to twist reality. Tonight, he had crossed into pure violence and done it with an audience, his mistress, smirking as if she held the crown. I knelt by my mother, my mind racing half daughter, half investigator. I noted every detail, the angle of the bruise, the fresh swelling on her ribs, the smell of alcohol on her clothes from his spilled drink. My hands pressed against her side and she winced so violently I knew something inside was cracked. The rage rose higher, but beneath it a cold clarity formed. This would not stay in the shadows anymore. Through the window, I saw the glow of headlights swinging across lawns, then the first pulse of red and blue washing over the street. Sirens wailed, cutting through the silence of our neighborhood, announcing that the violence in our house was no longer private. The flashing lights painted my mother's face in alternating colors, blood glistening under red, her bruises deepening under blue. The neighbors' whispers grew louder, the entire block now watching. I realized then that every secret, every bruise, every insult that had been buried for decades was about to be ripped into the open. And as the police car stopped at the curb and the doors opened, I felt something shift inside me. Fear and rage merged into one thought. This time, he would not gaslight us back into silence. This time, the law would step through the same doorway my mother had collapsed on, and the reckoning he never believed would come was about to walk in. I should have been surprised that night, but part of me had been waiting for it for years. My name is Rebecca Turner. I am 35 years old and I live in Greenville, Texas, a town so small that everyone knows which grocery store you shop at and what hymn you sang too loudly in church. I work as an investigator for an insurance company, a job that has trained me to spot the small cracks in a story, the inconsistencies that most people miss. That training also meant I had grown up cataloging the lies inside my own house. My father, Richard Turner, 65, used to be the town's golden man, a high school football coach who barked orders across the field and soaked up applause on Friday nights. People remembered him carrying the championship trophy in the early 90s, his arms slung around players he called sons. To the outside world, he was a man of discipline and loyalty. Inside our home, he was a tyrant, unpredictable as a storm that could roll in without warning. He would slam doors hard enough to rattle picture frames, raise his voice until the dog cowered, and then look at us as if daring us to contradict his version of reality. My mother, Linda, was the opposite. She spent her days baking pies for church fundraisers and knitting blankets for new babies, the kind of woman who delivered casseroles to grieving families and always sat in the same pew every Sunday. She absorbed my father's moods like a sponge, always telling me he was just tired or stressed or disappointed. Gaslighting had been the background music of my childhood. I remember being 10 years old, hiding under the kitchen table as my father threw a glass against the wall, shards skittering across the floor. He turned to me afterward, his voice suddenly calm, and told me I had imagined it, that nothing had happened. My mother swept up the pieces silently while I wondered if I was going crazy. Those contradictions carved themselves into me. By high school, I knew better than to bring friends over. By college, I knew how to read his footsteps on the porch, how to gauge whether the evening would be tense or tolerable. I left Greenville for a few years, chasing a life in Dallas, but when my mother's health faltered, I came back. She said she needed help with groceries, but I knew the truth. She needed another witness. That was when Denise entered the picture. Denise Miller was 45, divorced with bleached hair and nails painted a defiant red. She had been a secretary at the school for years, the kind of woman who leaned in too close to married men. People whispered about her long before she latched onto my father. At first, it was lunches in public places, then late nights explained away as reunions with old teammates. My mother tried to dismiss it, tried to believe that after 40 years of marriage, Richard would not humiliate her. But I saw the receipt as the charges on joint credit cards at hotels 3 towns over the perfume that lingered on his shirts. He started spending less time at home, more time with her, and when my mother dared to ask questions, he called her paranoid. That word became his weapon. Paranoid, useless, crazy. He chipped away at her reality until she started second-guessing her own memory. More than once, she called me at night whispering, asking if I thought she was imagining things. I wanted to drag her out of the house then, but she always begged me to let her stay, said she could not afford to leave, said the town would talk. The truth is, Greenville thrives on gossip but hates confrontation. People knew about Denise. They saw my father's truck parked outside her duplex. They looked away because it was easier to keep the myth of the honorable coach alive. That silence weighed heavier than any fist. I carried it with me every time I went to work. In my job, I sifted through staged car accidents and falsified fire claims, spotting the red flags others overlooked. I started applying the same eye to my father's life. Receipts for dinners that never included my mother. Cash withdrawals that lined up with weekends away. Little pieces of paper that told the story my mother tried not to read. And yet for years we stayed quiet. She convinced herself she could manage him, that if she kept the peace, he would not erupt. I convinced myself I could not take down my own father without tearing myself apart. That night at 1 a.m., when she collapsed at my door with bruises blooming across her skin, all the years of silence caught up to me. It was the culmination of decades of small humiliations, every slammed door, every denied truth, every moment she had been told she was worthless. Seeing her on my sofa bleeding made it undeniable. The golden man of Greenville was a fraud, and the mistress who had smirked behind him had pushed him deeper into cruelty. The town's silence had enabled it. My own hesitation had let it fester. Now the truth was inescapable. My mother's injuries were not just the result of a single night's violence. They were the end point of a long road of control, gaslighting, and betrayal. Looking back, I realized the bruises had begun years earlier, invisible bruises carved into her sense of self. That night was only when they became visible to the world. And as the police lights flashed outside, I knew we had crossed a line. There was no going back to pretending. The man who had once coached young boys about honor and discipline was about to be exposed for what he really was, and for the first time I was ready to make sure the whole town saw him clearly. When I laid my mother down on the sofa and pressed the towel to her mouth, I felt something shift inside me. It was not just fury, though. Fury roared like fire through my veins. It was clarity, a sharp edge cutting through years of hesitation. I had spent most of my life ducking under the weight of my father's moods, pretending the storm was not as violent as it looked, telling myself that if we stayed quiet long enough, it might pass. But that night, looking at the bruises blooming across my mother's face, I understood that silence was the rope he had used to bind us, and I was done being bound. I thought of every word he had spit at her. Useless, crazy, paranoid. He had repeated those words so often they became background noise as familiar as the hum of the refrigerator or the squeak of the screen door. Gaslighting was his favorite sport, and he had been playing it since I was old enough to listen. Tonight, he had raised the stakes, striking her to prove loyalty to his mistress, turning his fists into a love letter for another woman. That was the line I could not allow him to cross. I felt my pulse hammering in my temples as my mother tried to hold on to consciousness. She mumbled apologies for disturbing me, apologies for making a scene, apologies for failing to keep the peace. Those words gutted me more than her bruises. She was apologizing for being beaten. That was the poison he had dripped into her over decades. I leaned close and whispered back that she had nothing to apologize for, that the shame was his and his alone, that she would not face him alone again. My phone buzzed in my pocket with a neighbor's text asking if everything was all right, and the absurdity made me laugh bitterly. No, everything was not all right. Everything had never been all right. The difference now was that I was ready to do something about it. My mind snapped into the same focus I used at work. Gather evidence, document injuries, preserve proof. If my father thought he could twist reality again, he would find the record already written. I grabbed my camera and took photos of every bruise, every drop of blood on her shirt, every wince when I touched her ribs. I recorded her voice as she described what happened. Her words shook, but they were clear. He hit me. He said I was worthless. He said Denise was better. That recording alone was enough to dismantle his gaslighting. For years, he had claimed she exaggerated. Now, I had her truth on tape. The sirens outside grew louder closer, but I barely registered them. My focus was already shifting toward the next step. If the police saw this tonight, they might file a report, but in a town like Greenville, where my father still had old allies on the force, reports could get watered down. I needed a strategy that would not just document the violence but hold him accountable. I thought of Carla, my friend, who worked as a nurse at the county hospital. She could document the injuries with medical precision. I thought of Mr. Harris, the lawyer who had once helped me on a fraud case. He had warned me that abusive men often hide assets before the law catches up. If my father was funneling money to Denise, we could track it. A plan formed in my mind, as if it had been waiting there all along, tucked behind years of fear. I would not confront him blindly. I would build a case the way I built investigations at work, piece by piece, fact by fact, until the weight of truth crushed every lie. My mother clutched my hand and whispered again that she did not want the town to know. I shook my head and told her softly but firmly that the town already knew. They had known for years. The difference now was that I would not let them keep pretending. If they wanted to look away, they would have to look away from the flashing red and blue lights outside, from the photos I would spread across a courtroom, from the truth that would no longer stay locked inside our house. My father had always believed he was untouchable. He had the respect of the town, the loyalty of old students, the smirk of a mistress who thought she had won. But he had underestimated me. He had forgotten that I had spent years learning how to read lies, how to gather the threads that unravel a cover story. Tonight was not just about saving my mother. It was about dismantling his entire facade. The towel in my hand was soaked through the blood seeping into my skin, and I felt it like a brand. It was no longer enough to comfort her. I had to fight for her. For us. For the truth. And as the police lights bathed the living room walls in red and blue, I swore to myself that this would be the last night he raised a hand against her. From now on, every word, every bruise, every financial secret he had tried to bury would become ammunition. I would not strike with fists, but with proof, with exposure, with law. He had chosen violence to prove himself to a mistress. I would choose justice to end his reign of silence. That was the moment I crossed from daughter to warrior, from witness to avenger. And once I crossed that line, there was no going back. The morning after that night, I woke up with the smell of antiseptic still clinging to my hands. My mother had finally fallen asleep on the sofa after hours of pain, her face swollen against the pillow. The paramedics had checked her, but she refused to be taken to the hospital, terrified of the questions, terrified of what my father would do if she signed her name on a report. I let her stay, but I knew refusal would not stop me. If she would not step into the hospital, I would bring the hospital to her. I called Carla. She arrived just after sunrise, her hair tied back in a messy bun, her stethoscope hanging around her neck even though she was off shift. Carla had known me since high school, and she knew better than to waste time with sympathy. She went straight to my mother, examined the ribs, noted the swelling, wrote everything down. Fractured rib, bruised orbital socket, lacerated lip. She snapped photos with her phone and then emailed them directly to me, time-stamped, geotagged. Evidence number 1. While Carla worked, I turned my attention to my father's digital trail. Richard was careless with technology. He still thought deleting a text erased it forever. I had access to the joint phone account, and within minutes I had printed logs showing dozens of late-night calls to Denise. Not just calls, but messages dripping with arrogance. One read, "She cried again tonight. I shut her up." Another, "You'll get the house once she's gone." The words seared into me, each line another nail in his coffin. I saved every screenshot to a secure folder and backed it up twice, one on a hard drive, one on the cloud. Evidence number 2. Next came the finances. I logged into the shared bank account that my mother never touched because she said it gave her headaches. No wonder. Thousands of dollars funneled out over the past year. Charges at hotels an hour away. Jewelry purchases shipped not to our home, but to an address I recognized as Denise's duplex. And then the biggest discovery, a wire transfer for $20,000 labeled property down payment. When I traced the recipient, it was Denise. My father was buying her a house with marital funds. Evidence number 3. By midday, my anger had settled into something colder, sharper. This was no longer about bruises. It was theft, fraud, betrayal, stacked on top of violence. I drafted a timeline of every withdrawal, every suspicious charge. I cross-referenced them with his coaching pension deposits and saw how he siphoned his retirement into Denise's life while leaving my mother with nothing but bills. I imagined him smirking over beers with old friends, boasting about discipline and honor while secretly dismantling the life he had promised to protect. Carla finished her notes and squeezed my shoulder before leaving. She whispered that she had seen too many women like my mother, too many men like my father, and that documentation was the only way to break through the fog of denial. She promised to testify if needed. That promise steadied me. I called Mr. Harris. He was a lawyer with a sharp mind and a sharper tongue, a man who had once taken down a fraud ring with nothing but patient questions. When I told him what had happened, he did not gasp or hesitate. He asked for details, dates, amounts, screenshots. He told me to keep a log to write down every word my mother said, every bruise as it healed every threatening call that might come. He warned me that abusers escalate when they sense control slipping and that I should expect pushback not just from my father but from Denise. I laughed bitterly and told him Denise had already smirked at my mother in the grocery store last week. Harris said good let her arrogance show. Arrogance leaves fingerprints. That afternoon, I tested his theory. I went to the local diner where Denise liked to flaunt herself. She was there, red nails tapping on the counter, leaning into the ear of a man who looked bored. When she saw me, she smiled like a cat stretching in the sun. "Rebecca," she said loudly enough for the whole diner to hear. "How's your poor mother still pretending to be the martyr?" I gripped the edge of the counter to keep from lunging at her. She tilted her head and added, "Richard deserves better than a woman who cries over nothing." The room went quiet. Forks stopped clinking against plates. I forced myself to meet her eyes and say nothing. Instead, I pulled out my phone, opened the recorder, and let it capture every word dripping from her mouth. She thought it was a victory, but to me, it was evidence number 4. When I left the diner, my hands were shaking, but my mind was steady. Denise was reckless. She would hand me her own rope to hang her with. Back at home, my mother stirred awake, wincing with every movement. She asked where I had gone, and I told her not to worry. For once, she did not press me. Perhaps she sensed the steel in my voice. That night when the house was quiet, I sat at my desk and assembled the pieces: medical documentation, text messages, bank records, audio recordings, a timeline that stretched back months. Every page was another crack in my father's facade. I imagined presenting it all in court, one exhibit after another, watching the man who had taught me fear realize that his own carelessness had built the case against him. But I also knew this would not be enough. Men like him did not crumble easily. They fought, they threatened, they spun new lies. I needed more. I needed witnesses' allies, the town itself, to see what had been hidden. The next morning, I began quietly reaching out. To Mrs. Simmons, the neighbor who had seen my mother's bruises last Christmas. To Coach Daniels, my father's old colleague who had once confided that he worried about Richard's temper. To a cashier who had rung up Richard buying wine and roses while my mother sat home alone. Each conversation added threads. None were dramatic enough alone, but together they painted a portrait. The portrait of a man who had built his life on control and deception. The portrait of a mistress who cheered while he broke his vows. I gathered them carefully, weaving them into my log. By the 3rd day, my folder was thick, my case stronger. But with each piece came a new risk. My father called twice, leaving voicemails filled with venom. He said my mother was exaggerating. He said I was a traitor. He said if I dared drag his name through the mud, he would make sure I regretted it. I saved those voicemails too. Evidence number 5. Late one night, while my mother slept in my bed and I sat awake in the living room, I replayed one of his messages. His voice growled, "You're nothing without me, Rebecca, just like her. You think you can beat me with your little files? Try it." That was the moment I smiled a grim smile, but real. Because yes, I would try it, and for the first time, I believed I could win. The chance to confront him came sooner than I expected. 3 nights after my mother collapsed at my door, Richard called. His voice was slick with false concern, the way it always was when he wanted to reset the board. He said we needed to talk like a family. He said Linda was overreacting. He said Denise would come too because she deserved to clear her name. I almost laughed at the audacity, but instead I agreed. Let him think he was in control. Let him believe the old dynamics still held. In truth, I was already planning the ambush. I told Carla to be ready. I called Harris and asked if he could sit in. He said he would come, but only as an observer, not to tip our hand too early. I set up my living room with 2 chairs facing the couch. I placed my mother between me and Carla so she would not feel alone. I tested my recorder twice, tucked it behind the lamp. The air in the house felt like a live wire. When the knock came sharp and deliberate, my stomach clenched, but my face stayed calm. My father walked in first, broad shoulders, still carrying the swagger of his coaching days. Denise followed, her perfume cloying, her smile mocking. She crossed her legs and leaned back as if she were already queen of the castle. Richard looked around the room, saw Carla and Harris, and smirked. Trying to make this official, his voice dripped disdain. My mother flinched at the tone, but I steadied her hand with mine. I told him to sit. He did, but not before puffing out his chest and glaring at my mother. "Speak," he snapped. "Tell them how you imagined everything." For a second, Linda's mouth opened and closed like a trapped bird. Then I leaned forward and spoke instead. Enough. I played the first recording, my mother's trembling voice from that night. "He hit me. He said I was worthless. He said Denise was better." The words filled the room, undeniable. My father's face twisted. "That's not real." But before he could spin further, I slid photos across the table. The bruises, the medical notes, Carla's signed statement. Evidence stacked like stones. He tried again, louder this time. She bruises easy, she falls all the time. Denise laughed high and sharp. She always trips over her own feet. My jaw clenched, but I did not take the bait. Instead, I pulled out the bank statements, the hotel bills, the jewelry receipts, the $20,000 transfer. My father's hand slammed the table so hard, the lamp rattled. "Stop digging through my life." I met his eyes and said, "You mean through Mom's life, through the money you stole from her." For the first time, I saw uncertainty flicker behind his rage. Denise shifted in her seat, her smirk faltering. Harris leaned forward, cool and calm, and asked Richard to explain the transfer. Richard's voice rose blustering about privacy, about loyalty, about how no one in this room respected him anymore. Carla snorted, unable to hide her disgust. That broke something in him. He lurched forward, pointing at my mother, his finger trembling with fury. "You ruin everything. You make me look weak." The mask was gone. The golden man of Greenville was nothing but a bully with spit flying from his mouth. I let the silence hang for a beat, then pressed play on the diner recording. Denise's own voice filled the room. Richard deserves better than a woman who cries over nothing. The blood drained from her face. She lunged to grab my phone, but I pulled it back steady as stone. The room erupted. My mother sobbed quietly. Carla's eyes burned. Harris scribbled notes. My father rose to his feet, red with rage, and for a terrifying second I thought he would strike again. He raised his hand halfway before realizing every eye was on him, every device recording. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered it. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. I stood then, my knees steady. "This is over. You will not touch her again. You will not steal from her again. The next time you see us will be in front of a judge." My father tried to laugh a hollow sound, but the power had shifted. Denise tugged at his sleeve, whispering furiously, but he shrugged her off. He tried one last attempt at gaslighting, saying I had poisoned my mother against him, that I was jealous of Denise, that I wanted to destroy the family legacy. I cut him off with a single sentence. "No, Dad, you destroyed it yourself." His mouth opened, but no words came. For once, Richard Turner, the man who had dominated every room he entered, stood speechless. I told Harris to expect my call the next morning. I told Carla to save her statement. And then I opened the front door wide, gesturing for my father and his mistress to leave. For a moment, they hesitated as if waiting for me to back down. I did not. One by one, the neighbors' porch lights flicked on outside silhouettes forming behind curtains. Word traveled fast in Greenville. They would know soon enough. Richard finally turned muttering curses under his breath and stormed out. Denise followed her heels clicking against the floor, her smirk gone. The door shut behind them with a finality that rattled through me. My mother collapsed against the cushions, sobbing not from fear this time, but from release. I crouched beside her and whispered that we were free. "Not yet," she said weakly, "but soon." And I believed her. The confrontation had not ended the war, but it had ended the silence. The evidence was ready, the witnesses willing the mask torn off. For the first time, my father knew he could not control the narrative anymore. For the first time, the truth had spoken louder than his fists. The courthouse smelled of dust and disinfectant, a place where truth and lies collided daily. But that morning it felt like the stage for a reckoning decades overdue. My mother walked slowly beside me, her arm hooked through mine for balance. The bruises had faded from purple to yellow, but the shadows remained. Her ribs were still tender, her eye still swollen. She wore her church dress, the one she had always saved for Easter, as if dignity could be armor. We entered the courtroom together, and I felt the weight of eyes on us. Small-town trials always drew crowds, and Greenville had been buzzing since the night sirens lit our street. Former students of my father sat in the benches whispering. Neighbors leaned forward, hungry for spectacle. Some looked at me with pity, others with suspicion. Few dared look at my mother for long. At the front, Richard sat stiff-backed beside his lawyer, his jaw clenched, his tie too tight. Denise was there too, forced by subpoena, her arms crossed, her red nails chipped. She tried to meet my eyes with a smirk, but it faltered when I did not look away. The judge, an older man with weary eyes, banged the gavel. The case was called Richard Turner, charged with aggravated assault, domestic battery, and misappropriation of marital funds. The words sounded clinical, but to me, they sounded like the echo of every bruise, every slammed door, every whispered apology my mother had given across 40 years. Harris rose first. He moved with quiet confidence, his voice calm but cutting. He laid out the case not with theatrics, but with precision. Exhibit A, photographs of my mother's injuries, time-stamped, signed by Carla the nurse. Exhibit B, medical notes confirming fractured rib and contusions. Exhibit C, audio recording of my mother's trembling voice describing the assault. The courtroom was silent except for her words, and when they played, even the judge leaned forward, frowning. Richard shifted uncomfortably, his lawyer whispering furiously in his ear. Then Harris unveiled the bank records. Screens projected hotel bills, jewelry receipts, the $20,000 transfer to Denise. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Denise's face went pale. Richard's lawyer tried to object, but the judge allowed it. Financial abuse was part of the pattern Harris argued, evidence of betrayal entwined with violence. I watched my father's hands grip the table tighter, the same hands that had once gripped my mother's wrists to shake her silent. Harris pressed play on another recording, my father's own voicemail, his voice thick with venom. "You're nothing without me, Rebecca. Just like her. Try it." The words echoed through the room, his arrogance captured forever. A gasp broke from the benches. I saw Mrs. Simmons, our neighbor, cover her mouth. The myth of Richard Turner. The honorable coach cracked audibly. Then came the diner recording. Denise's voice filled the courtroom, sharp and mocking. Richard deserves better than a woman who cries over nothing. She shifted uncomfortably, trying to explain it away, but Harris pounced. Better how, Ms. Miller? Better because she endures bruises quietly. Better because she stays silent when he buys you houses with stolen money. Denise faltered her words, stumbling. She tried to glare at me, but the judge silenced her with a look. And then it happened. The slip. Under pressure, Denise blurted, "Richard promised me he'd get rid of Linda once and for all." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, shouts, even the bailiff struggled to quiet the noise. My stomach clenched. My mother squeezed my hand so hard it hurt. Denise's face crumpled as she realized what she had admitted. The judge banged his gavel, demanding order. Harris seized the moment. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not just a case of temper. This is a pattern. Violence, gaslighting, financial betrayal, and a mistress who cheered it on. They plotted to erase a wife of 40 years as if she were disposable." Richard's lawyer tried to object, tried to spin, but the damage was done. The slip was undeniable. Richard's face turned red, then gray, his mask slipping entirely. For once, he did not look like a coach or a father. He looked like a criminal caught in the act. When the defense finally spoke, it was weak. They claimed stress, claimed exaggeration, claimed manipulation by me. They tried to paint me as the bitter daughter with an agenda, but the evidence was relentless. Photos, recordings, witnesses. Carla testified with clinical precision. Mrs. Simmons recounted Christmas bruises. The cashier confirmed the roses and wine bought for Denise. Piece by piece, the puzzle assembled into a picture too clear to deny. As Harris delivered his closing, he looked not just at the judge, but at the crowd. Silence allows violence to thrive. For too long, this town has whispered instead of acted. Today, you have the chance to end that silence. I looked around the room. Former students who had idolized my father stared at him now with betrayal. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably, realizing their gossip had been complicity. My mother sat straighter, her hands folded, her eyes wet but steady. The judge called recess, then returned with the verdict. Guilty of aggravated assault, guilty of domestic battery, guilty of misappropriation of marital funds. A restraining order was granted. Assets were frozen. Restitution was ordered. And beyond that, the district attorney announced intent to pursue further charges of fraud. The gavel fell. My mother gasped, her shoulders collapsing with relief. Richard stood, fists clenched, but the bailiff's hand on his arm reminded him his reign was over. Denise tried to slip out quietly, but reporters swarmed their cameras, flashing her earlier arrogance, now immortalized as shame. The courtroom emptied slowly, the buzz of gossip filling the halls. But I did not care about them. I cared about my mother's trembling smile as she whispered, "It's over, Rebecca." For the first time in decades, it truly was. As we walked out of the courthouse into the sunlight, the weight on my chest lifted. Justice had not erased the years of pain, but it had drawn a line my father could never cross again, a line the town could never pretend not to see. The days after the verdict moved like a storm, clearing fast, disorienting, but unmistakably brighter. Greenville buzzed with the fallout. Richard Turner, once the town's proud coach, was now the man in orange scrubs photographed with his head down as deputies escorted him. The local paper ran the headline, "Beloved Coach Convicted of Assault and Fraud." Some called it tragedy. I called it truth, finally unmasked. Denise vanished from her duplex the same week. Her landlord taped an eviction notice to the door, and word spread she had slunk off to another county. Her name, once whispered with envy by women who noticed her jewelry, became shorthand for disgrace. When someone gossiped about arrogance, they called it pulling a Denise. My mother and I stayed quiet in those weeks, but silence had a new texture. Not the fearful hush of bruises hidden, but the calm of safety. She moved into my house permanently, though she still flinched when a car door slammed outside. Healing, I learned, was not linear. She cried sometimes without warning, folding laundry or watching the news as if the years of suppressed grief were finally demanding their time. I sat with her through each wave. We visited Carla often, who checked her ribs, adjusted medication, but more than that, reminded her she was not alone. Harris guided us through the tangle of frozen assets. The judge had ordered restitution, half of Richard's pension secured for Linda, the marital home signed over to her name. For the first time, she had financial ground under her feet. She bought new locks for the doors, not because she expected Richard to return, but because control over her space mattered. Watching her choose the locks, watching her hand the keys to me, I realized power can live in small gestures. The town's reaction was complicated. Some avoided us in the grocery store, unwilling to face their complicity. Others approached quietly, pressing my hand, whispering they wished they had spoken sooner. One former player of my father's stopped me on Main Street and said, "Coach taught me discipline, but you taught me courage." That sentence stayed with me. My father filed appeals from jail, each one more desperate than the last, but Harris dismantled them swiftly. The recordings, the photos, Denise's own slip, they were airtight. His power had always been built on people's willingness to look away. With the evidence dragged into light, there was nowhere left to hide. At night, when the house was quiet and my mother slept peacefully for the first time in years, I sat by the window and let the silence wrap around me. It felt earned. I thought about the girl I had been hiding in my room while my father's voice thundered through the walls. I thought about the woman I had become, recorder in hand, facing him across my own living room. The line between those selves was drawn in blood and resolve, but it was a line I would never let blur again. My mother began attending church again, her chin lifted, her dress ironed. The congregation welcomed her back, some sheepishly, others with warmth. When the pastor preached about truth setting us free, I saw her nod, tears glistening, but no longer heavy with shame. One Sunday, she whispered to me, "I don't feel invisible anymore." That was victory greater than any verdict. As for me, I returned to work with a sharper edge. Every insurance claim I investigated, every fraud I uncovered, I carried the memory of this case like a compass. Justice was not abstract anymore. It had a face, my mother's. It had a sound, the crack of a gavel declaring guilty, and it had a promise never again would I let silence shield cruelty. Months later, Greenville had settled into a new rhythm, one where my father's name was no longer spoken with reverence, but with caution. My mother and I built our own rhythm too. We planted a small garden behind my house, just tomatoes and basil at first. Watching her dig her hands into the soil, I realized healing could grow from the ground up. Each sprout felt like defiance, each bloom like proof that life continued. She laughed more often now, a sound I had almost forgotten. Sometimes she still startled when a door slammed or when an unfamiliar car slowed near the house, but she always looked to me and steadied. She had armor now, not just in me, but in the truth finally exposed. Richard remained behind bars. His once proud colleagues stopped visiting. His appeals dwindled. Denise never returned to Greenville. Rumor said she worked at a diner 2 counties over, head down, name avoided. For us, the absence was a gift. We no longer had to cross the street to avoid her, no longer had to feel her eyes on us in the grocery aisle. I thought often about the night my mother collapsed at my door. How the clock read 1 a.m., how the air smelled of rain, how her voice rasped that he had hit her again. That moment had been the fracture line of my life. Before silence, after resistance. I carried that line inside me like a scar, not painful anymore, but instructive. My work changed too. I became sharper, more relentless in my investigations. Colleagues noticed. Some asked why I pushed so hard. I never told them the whole story, but I always said because truth matters even when people want to look away. The truth is the only thing that keeps the powerful from devouring the vulnerable. One evening, sitting on the porch with my mother as the sun dipped behind the oaks, she turned to me and asked if I regretted it, dragging everything into the open, tearing down the image of our family. I shook my head. No, I said. The image was never real. What we have now, this peace, this freedom, is real. She squeezed my hand, her eyes glistening, and whispered, "Thank you for saving me." But the truth was, I had saved myself too. I had reclaimed the silence that used to suffocate us and turned it into space where we could breathe. If there was one lesson carved from all of this, it was that silence is the ally of cruelty. Abusers thrive in the shadows in whispered excuses and diverted eyes. Breaking that silence is terrifying. It risks backlash, it exposes wounds, but it is the only path to dignity. Justice is not neat. It does not erase scars, but it draws lines, and sometimes those lines are enough to rebuild a life. To anyone listening, I say this: if you see bruises, if you hear the cracks in someone's voice, do not turn away. Speak. Document. Stand beside them. Truth is stronger when carried together. My family's legacy will never again be measured by the lies of a man who thought control was love. It will be measured by the courage it took to end it, by the garden blooming in my backyard, by the sound of my mother's laughter at dusk, by the promise that the next generation in Greenville will know silence is not safety. That is the justice we earned. That is the dignity we keep.